Hello, beautiful people, and welcome to Furina pre-release analysis. Woohoo! This one's gonna be a long one. We have a lot of things to talk about. And the reason why is because Furina does something that's actually pretty much new. So, without further ado, let's take a look at her kit and analyze it. First off, base HP, 15,307. Now, as we're gonna see later, she is an HP scaler, so that high base HP is nice. Base attack, 244, doesn't really matter. Base defense, 696, also doesn't really matter because she's not really gonna spend time on field. So she's not really gonna be vulnerable to taking damage, so the higher base defense doesn't really do that much. And then she has a crit rate ascension, which is pretty good. She is a sword user, Hydro, obviously. Let's get into her talents. We're gonna skip over the normal attack for now. We'll come back to it later. Elemental skill, Salon Solitaire. Invites the guests of the Salon Solitaire to come forth and abet in Furina's performance. We'll summon either the Salon members or the Singer of Many Waters based on Furina's current Arca alignment. So, she can be either Uzia or Pneuma. She starts baseline, I believe she starts Uzia, and when you do a charge attack, it'll swap. The Uzia one, the one that she starts with by default, as far as I understand, it goes as follows. Foaming bubbles like celebrants shall dance, dealing AoE hydro damage based on Furina's max HP, and summoning 3 Salon members. The ball octopus-shaped Gentilhomme Usher, the bubbly seahorse-shaped Surintendant Cheval Marin, and the armored crab-shaped Mademoiselle Crabaletta. So you got an octopus, a seahorse, and a crab. They will attack nearby opponents at intervals, prioritizing the target of the active character, dealing hydro damage based on max HP. Now, one thing you might notice is AoE hydro damage for the cast, hydro damage for this. Each of the individual creatures has a different attack speed and size, and the 2 fastest attacking ones, which are the seahorse and the octopus, have basically no AoE. Basically, the fastest attacking one has no AoE whatsoever, the middle of the pack one has a little tiny bit of AoE, and the slowest one has an okay-ish amount of AoE. And the slowest one has an okay-ish amount of AoE. When they attack, if characters with more than 50% HP are nearby, the members will increase the current attack's power based on the number of such characters, and consume said character's HP. If the characters who meet these requirements are 1, 2, 3, or 4, or more, but that only matters when you're doing trials, the members' attacks will deal 110, 20, 30, 40% of their original damage. So, for each character whose HP you're consuming, her damage is increased by 10%, up to 40%. Now let's take a look at the numbers. So you have the octopus that deals about 10% max HP, the seahorse about 5.5, and the crab about 14. The seahorse is the fastest. I was looking at some footage of how many attacks you get from each, and this is what I got, and this was footage of the most recent version. Now, that doesn't actually line up with some of the other leaks that we got, which means it is very possible that these numbers are not exactly accurate. It's possible this is 13 or 14 or 15, because we're getting some contradictory information. It's like 12, 13. We can do 13, because realistically, over a 20-second rotation, you're not finishing your rotation exactly at 20 seconds on for most people. But we'll get into that a little bit later. Anyways, point being, when they attack, they also consume HP. 1.6 for the Cheval Marin, 2.4 for the Gentilhomme Usher, and 3.6 for Mademoiselle Crabaletta, which gives us a total of about 50% of your team's HP being consumed. There's a lot of implications to this. Implication number 1, you now have a reliable way to drain your character's HP, which means any on-fielder can now use Maréchaussée to get that 36% crit rate, plus normal and charge attack damage bonus from the 2-piece. The other implications are going to start mattering once we look at the burst. Anyways, that's if she is on the Uzia alignment. If she is on the Pneuma alignment, summons the Singer of Many Waters, who will heal nearby active characters based on max HP at intervals. The Salon members and Singer of Many Waters share a duration, and when Furina uses her charge attack to change the guest type, the new guest will inherit the initial duration. While her E is active, she can move on water. This is not a real thing. That's the very unfortunate reality. The healing is only to the active party member, and it's decent healing, but it doesn't apply hydro or generate particle or deal damage. When you're healing, you lose the rest of what her skill does, and that's basically never worth it. This is to make her feel comfortable in Overworld, I think. Because in Overworld, you'll be able to heal back up, and you're not gonna have to run a healer in your party if you want to use her. But I really don't think it's worth using her as a healer for your team. Furina's skill cooldown is 20 seconds, and it lasts for a total of 30 seconds, which means it's very easy to have 100% uptime on it. Next up, Elemental Burst. Let the people rejoice. Rouses the impulse to revel, creating a stage of foam that will deal AoE hydro damage based on Furina's max HP, and cause nearby party members to enter the universal revelry state. During this time, when nearby party members' HP increases or decreases, 1 fanfare point will be granted to Furina for each percentage point of their max HP by which their HP changes. At the same time, Furina will increase the damage dealt by an incoming healing bonus of all nearby party members based on the amount of fanfare she has. When the duration ends, Furina's fanfare points will be cleared. It's a lot of words. What it means is, whenever your HP changes, you gain a stack of her burst, and stacks of her burst makes you deal more damage and heal more. So, if you're playing Cookie, you use your E, it consumes 30% of your current HP, and then you heal back up with your E, you lost 30% HP and then gain 30% HP, so that's 60% HP change, which means 60 stacks. Now, she drains, like we said, about 50% of your party's HP over 20 seconds. And that's the whole party, which is 200 stacks. If you also heal it back up, that's 400 stacks. Now, it caps out at 300. One thing to keep in mind, though, is it only starts counting stacks when you use Furina's Burst, and things that heal or drain HP over time will give you stacks later on in your rotation. What that means is, for the first rotation, you're very likely going to be a bit weaker than for the second rotation, because on the first rotation, you start full HP. Whereas on the second rotation, you can start with your HP gone because of her drain, and then you use her burst, and you immediately swap to a healer, full heal your whole team, and because your whole team was at 50%, that's 200 stacks just from that. Ascension 1 passive, when the active character in your party receives healing, if the source of the healing is not Furina herself and the healing overflows, then Furina will heal a nearby party member for 2% of their max HP once every 2 seconds for the next 4 seconds. What this means is, if you have a single target healer that doesn't heal the whole team, you can somewhat alleviate that by overhealing, and that's going to heal the rest of your party. However, it's not a lot. 2% once every 2 seconds for the next 4 seconds. Realistically, if you're overhealing, you're not just going to overheal once. You're probably going to be overhealing for about 6-ish seconds. So you're going to have this passive for about 10 seconds. I'd be generous and say you get 6 procs of it. That's 12% of max HP, which is, I mean, you know, if you have some fanfare, that's going to be slightly increased by this, but it's not a very large amount, right? It's definitely not enough to make up for this 50% you're losing. So it's not going to be enough to, by itself, offset her HP drain, but it will, at the very least, somewhat alleviate your healing requirements, especially for characters that don't have a good way of healing the whole party. Now, finally, Unheard Confession. Every 1000 point of Furina's max HP can buff the different Arca-aligned Salon Solitaire in the following ways. Will increase Salon member damage dealt by 0.7% up to a maximum of 28%, and will decrease active character healing interval of the Singer of Many Waters by 0.4% up to a maximum of 16%. So, like we said, second part doesn't matter that much because her healing mode doesn't matter too much outside of Overworld. So this is just up to 28% more damage bonus, which is alright. Let's get into the numbers now. Right now I'm looking at talent level 9, because that's what I usually do in the pre-releases. Just know that it does actually scale decently well with talent levels, so it might be something that could be worth crowning. 0.23% per fanfare. Now, if you max that out, it's a nice little 70 damage percent. 75 if it's crowned. That's a very large amount. Now, it has an 18-second duration. That's a pretty long duration. Yeah, this is a team-wide buff as well, but it is not unconditional. Number one, you're not actually gonna have 300. It's more so gonna be more likely 200 to start with, ramping up to 300. So starting at about 45 up to about 70. And number two, and much more importantly, this forces you to use a healer in your team. And not just any healer. Some healers don't actually work very well with her. Now, here's the thing. because her buff is so big, and as we're gonna see, her personal damage is also pretty good. If you could just put her on your team without asking questions, you wouldn't really ever have a reason not to. If there wasn't the requirement for a healer, you'd start seeing her in almost every team. However, the requirement for a healer is going to somewhat limit the sort of things she can do, not because it's going to make her an unviable option in teams, but because it's going to force a different unit to be a healer and one of the healers that works well with her, instead of not a healer. So you'll be forced to, for example, replace your Kazuha with Jean, which is a pretty big loss in terms of utility. Kazuha's grouping is very, very valuable. Kazuha also offers a decent amount of damage percent, which, while less than what Furina provides, is still relevant. That's the first, obstacle that she has. The second obstacle is that her Hydro application is slower. It's not incredibly slow, but it's definitely not as fast as Xingqiu or Yelan. Teams that need to maintain a Hydro aura, specifically a Hydro aura, like Hu Tao Vape, won't really be able to use her as a single Hydro unit. They will potentially be able to use her in double Hydro teams, and we'll be talking about that. But there is that other potential limitation. Next, let's talk about the numbers on her skill. So we have 5.49, 10.13, and 14.09, multiplied by 1.4 because of this, assuming your characters are above 50% HP, which is a total amount of motion value that's fairly high for an HP scaler. Obviously, we'll get into it a lot deeper than just the motion value, but to give you a point of reference, Yelan, actually, I have to add the 13.4 from the cast and the 19.4. Okay, if we compare only motion values, she tends to lag behind Yelan. A decent amount too. However, a lot of things go into that. This is Yelan with 2 elemental skills per rotation. With 1, the gap is a little bit lower. But also, and more importantly, Furina benefits from her own buff. She benefits from her own team-wide buff. Not only that, her buff is bigger, and the ramp up is faster, and it buffs other off-field characters. The ER requirements we'll talk about. I just want to give a frame of reference, so to contextualize these numbers. I'm not saying that Furina is going to do less damage than Yelan. That's going to depend a lot on which teams you end up using. But if you're putting both in the same team, then Yelan would do more damage. Which means, if you want to be using her instead of Yelan, you need to be getting value out of the rest of her kit. You need to be getting value out of those buffs that she's giving to the team. You need to be actually stacking up your fanfare, so that her personal damage becomes higher and can become closer to Yelan's. You need to make sure you're always above 50%, because when you're not above 50%, this stops working and her damage just gets pretty shafted, right? She loses 40%. Well, it's not actually 40, it's like 30% of her damage. Anyways, all of this to say, in a vacuum, her personal damage will be lower, which means in order for her to be better in a given team, you have to look at the rest. And she definitely can be better in some teams. So let's start talking about the sort of team archetypes that might be interested in using her. First off, we talk about Hyperbloom, because it's Hyperbloom. What are the upsides and what are the downsides? Downside number 1, your healer options for Hyperbloom tend to heal less. The most popular one is Cookie, and Cookie's healing is going to struggle a lot to keep up with Furina's HP drain. That's a pretty big downside. Downside number 2, she applies less Hydro, so that's less seeds, right? Well, that's both a downside and an upside. Less Hydro means less seeds, yes, but it also means you're consuming less Dendro from the enemies, which can mean more Quicken uptime. And that's where you start looking at more Quickbloom, right? And as a reminder, the main difference between Hyperbloom and Quickbloom is you'll get a lot more Quicken uptime on Quickbloom, which makes it so that your Electro and or Dendro characters are going to have a lot more personal damage through those Quicken procs. Another downside is she doesn't buff the actual Hyperbloom damage. She'll buff the Quicken damage, sure, but Hyperbloom damage doesn't actually get increased by damage percent. So, what does that leave you with? Well, really, for both Hyperbloom and Quickbloom, you don't really want to use her with Cookie as your only healer, because you're gonna really struggle to keep up enough uptime on her higher damage from your characters being above 50%, and you're also going to struggle to actually get a lot of fanfare stacks. So who is a good healer that can replace Cookie in those teams? Well, you can still use Cookie on top of another healer, obviously, right? Because a lot of people don't have Raiden, and Raiden tends to be the only other real off-field option for Hyperbloom. Cookie is still usable, but as an only healer, it's a little bit iffy. So who else can you use? You can use Dory, but Dory has a similar problem to Cookie where her healing is a little bit better than Cookie's, but it's also only single target. It's only to the active character, which is also a pretty big issue. So that leaves you with Xiao, Baiju, and Kokomi. Kokomi also having that like certain amount of limitation because her skill only heals on-field character, but if you can afford spending field time on her, then her burst will heal the whole team. And I think with those teams, with those units, you can get pretty good results in a bunch of different Hyperbloom and Quickbloom teams. Another thing that is also very relevant, but that some people might not be thinking about, is that, yeah, it's cool and all that you know, heal back up and then drain your HP and all that, and it forces you to run a healer, cool. But if you want to get a lot of fanfare stacks, you want to use your heal at the beginning of your rotation, right? Before you actually swap to your carry. Which means, after you've been on your carry for a while, Furina's going to drain their HP back down. And one thing that you are going to have to keep in mind when using teams with Furina is you're actually going to feel a lot squishier. For the same reason that Lyney feels fairly squishy, which is that he spends a decent amount of time not at 100% HP. Now, depending on which healer you use, that might not be too much of a problem. But when you look at healers like Jean, especially, healers like Charlotte, which we're gonna very quickly cover as well, you get a lot of healing early on, but you don't get a lot of healing afterwards, which means that you'll be pretty fragile towards the end of your rotation. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Anyways, in Hyperbloom, I mean, if she's the only Hydro in there, it's a Quickbloom team, right? So Hyperbloom is really going to be mostly for like when you're playing double Hydro, either with a double Hydro with something like Xingqiu or Yelan, in which case you would probably go for a Baiju or Xiao as a healer and then an Electro trigger. Or you can use something like Kokomi and then have something like Nahida, Raiden, Cookie, and the Quickbloom teams where she would be the only unit, the only Hydro unit, where you'll get her plus, again, generally Baiju or Xiao, and then an additional either Dendro or Electro unit on top of your trigger. But yeah, all of this to say, she has a lot of options, but she does force you to warp your team a little bit to include a healer. There's also obviously Neuvillette Hyperbloom, but I'll be keeping Neuvillette teams for the end because I think they behave slightly differently than others because of his ability to gain stacks from his own healing. Next thing I want to talk about is Vape teams with all of the Pyro carries, right? The on-fielders. For most of the Pyro units, she doesn't actually apply enough Hydro. You're going to need more Hydro than what you have from her to be able to reliably vape things. It should be enough if you start on the right timing for a unit like Yoimiya and Daya, but I'm not 100% sure on that. It's going to depend slightly on the timers. I haven't actually covered this yet, but she has special ICD. It's not standard. It's also not no ICD. The horse applies Hydro every other hit. The octopus applies every other hit. The crab applies every hit. So depending on how the timers end up lining up exactly, it might work out for Yoimiya and for Daya. I don't really see it working out for Hu Tao, probably not for Diluc, not for Yanfei, definitely not Klee. But that's as a solo Hydro unit. And the reality is, you don't have to play her as a solo Hydro. You can play her as double Hydro. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you want to actually properly heal yourself back up, Bennett isn't really gonna work. Bennett does heal a lot. However, he only heals characters that are below 70%, and he only heals the current active party member. Which means, at best, you'll have to trade uptime on Bennett's buff in order to heal the rest of your team. And at worst, you're just not getting stacks because you're not healing the rest of your team. But then on top of that, pairing Bennett with some of the other healers can actually make it harder to maintain Hydro application. Pairing Bennett with Jean, you're gonna get Sunfire and you're not gonna keep Hydro app. Pairing Bennett with Sayu, in AoE it should be fine. In single target, you're gonna start swirling away the Hydro aura. So okay, Well, that means you play Yoimiya, you play Furina, we're going to use Barbara as a placeholder. If you use Bennett, you're going to have to choose between getting Animo, which is a pretty, you know, it's VV, it's a lot, or getting a healer. And there's no reason to play Furina if you don't have a healer. So you'd have to go for a character like Mika, for example. However, you can also consider ditching Bennett altogether and going for something like this with Mika, or with Charlotte, or with, I mean, at this point, you could actually use Jean, right? And have a different last slot. There's going to be a lot of variety in terms of the sort of teams that you end up being able to do. And again, right, this is with the assumption that she is enough Hydro to let Yoimiya vape, which should be the case, but I am not 100% sure about it. Yeah, and you could potentially use Yunjin as a last slot because Yunjin is a fairly interchangeable unit with Bennett when it comes to the amount of buff you get on Yoimiya. So I could definitely see something like this, although then specifically this, you would actually kind of get because you'd have to use Yoimiya's burst for your setup, and that might... I guess you could do a setup with a Yoimiya charge attack, but that might be a little bit too cope. I don't know how I feel about the VV Vape with her. I think in most situations it's not really going to be doable. It's going to be a screenshot thing. I don't know if I really see it being a real thing outside of screenshots. But you can very much still use something like Yoimiya, Furina, Healer that's not VV, and Bennett, or any other unit that can work well with Yoimiya. Similar thing for Dea, but Dea is just worse. All in all, I think solo Hydro reverse vape is not really ideal because I think you're better off playing double Hydro reverse vape in most situations, right? Even with those characters that have slower up, why not go for, right, something like this? If you think you can get away without any form of resistance or interruption, which is pretty rough on Yoimiya, but hey, if you're killing enemies fast enough, you might be all right. You can do something like this as well, right? And yeah, you're not really getting the VV on Yoimiya, but at least you're getting VV on the Hydro. And hell, there might be some setups you can do that do get a double swirl. Depending on how the timings line up exactly, you might be able to use Yoimiya's bursts for that. But you don't have to use Jean. You can also use another healer. Any other healer, really. With double Hydro, you can use something like Baiju or Yao Yao. It's not ideal because you will lose some vapes for the Burgeons you're getting, but it does kind of work. You can use a character like Mika again. And that's a name you're going to hear a lot in this pre-release. Mika gains a lot from Furina, because Mika is one of the very few healers that full heals your party with one button, and also has a decent amount of healing over time after that, which is going to make it so that your on-fielder doesn't go back down to 50% HP while you're on them. Anyways, this double Hydro core can be used with any of the pyro units. You can use it with Hu Tao, with Diluc, and then all you need is a healer on the last slot. And this is where a pretty funny idea comes in, which is Prototype Amber Mona 4-piece Maiden's healing bonus. Now, is that a great idea? Maybe not, but it is going to be a viable option. What are the upsides? What are the downsides? Upsides, well, Mona actually does something. A damage bonus, like if you're playing with Hu Tao, for example. A damage bonus is nice. Downside, Proto Amber with a full healing set doesn't heal 50% of your character's HP. It heals about 30-something%, which means that you're only going to have about 60% uptime on the additional damage from your characters being above 50% HP on Furina's damage, and you're not actually going to fully stack Fanfare. Is it amazing? No. It might be a thing that people end up seeing. Next up, let's talk about Furina in teams that aren't really focused on reactions. So, for example, you'll be able to do something like this, or this. With a triple Hydro core with Yelan, Xingqiu, Furina, you'll be generating enough energy that basically all three of them will have fairly trivial ER requirements. On top of that, you have Hydro Resonance, which increases both Furina and Yelan's damage, and you get a lot of damage percent from Furina. All in all, this is actually gonna be pretty good. I think Mono Hydro is getting a pretty big buff from Furina's release. But that's not just Mono Hydro like this. Now, I don't have Kokomi on this account, but you can also do something like this with a unit like Kazuha, a unit like Zhongli, a unit like Venti, if you want some grouping. And it will also be good. Now, when it comes to something like this, I would personally prefer running Xingqiu over over Eula for the added resistance to interruption, but both would be pretty good. All in all, Monopyro, one of the pretty big winners of Furina's release. And hell, you can do this if you want, and it'll work out as well. So did I say Monopyro? Monohydro, you know what I meant. Next up, let's talk about freeze. So you'll be able to do something like a freeze team with a cryo carry, with a cryo healer, Animo Furina. You can do a character like Shenhe as a second unit with Jean Furina. You can do Jean, Furina, Eula, Furina Xingqiu. If you're playing a character that doesn't need the cryo energy, like Risley, for example. You can play a cryo healer like Charlotte, who's coming out soon, or Mika. But yeah, you've got a few possible variations for freeze, all of which should be fairly decent. We can talk about Taser, I guess. I don't know how I feel about Taser, right? The traditional Taser core is this. If you're running Furina instead here, you'll have to get healing from something else. Maybe you can go for Sayu or Jean instead of this, but I'm not a huge fan. Don't really want to go for Kuki because it's not really enough healing. Dori should work in a team like this because you can, like, you're not stuck to one character. So even if her healing is single target, you can just swap to heal every character, but it's still not ideal. Next up, Nilou teams. And Nilou teams are interesting because they don't benefit from the damage bonus basically very much at all. However, her AoE is a bit bigger than a character like Eula, and Nilou teams always run a healer anyways, so you're not forced to change your team to accommodate her, and you'll be able to max out your passive very early into your rotation, which means that she's actually just gonna be a fairly decent option in Nilou teams as well. You got like Nilou, you've got Nahida, and then you've got like Yao Furina, or Baiju Furina. One thing that a lot of people tend to forget is that in Nilou teams, Nahida is built on her normal damage build, which means that she will benefit a decent amount from that damage percent. It's not completely wasted on the rest of the team. She'll be an overall pretty decent option in here. Here's the thing though. I think we've covered most of the archetypes that would generally want a Hydro unit in them. However, because her personal damage is pretty alright, and her buff is so big, you're also going to see her in teams that don't necessarily need a Hydro unit. So for example, Noelle teams. Noelle teams are actually going to get a huge buff from Furina's release because you're already healing more than enough from Noelle to overcome Furina's drain, which means you'll be able to play either a triple Geo with Furina or double Geo, double Hydro, or like I mentioned earlier, Noelle as a healer for triple Hydro. But overall, Noelle teams in general are going to very much like Furina. And I think there's an argument to be made that Noelle teams might be better than Itto teams with Furina, because Itto cannot heal like Noelle can, and therefore doesn't have great synergy with Furina because you don't have a Geo healer that can properly heal. Right? The closest thing you have is Goro's Constellation 4, which is barely even enough to offset the HP drain on one character, let alone all four. Another team is going to be Wanderer teams. Wanderer is a character who does not get a lot of damage percent from external sources. He gets a little bit from Farazan, and that's really it. Another thing, Wanderer's signature set is fine, but Marie-José gives you a lot more stat than his set does. And therefore, there are going to be pretty good reasons to play Furina with Wanderer. Now, I will preface this with a warning. It is going to be very difficult to fit resistance to interruption in Wanderer teams that use Furina, unlike his current default teams. However, there is a very real possibility that Wanderer, Farazan, Mika, Furina could be his highest damage team, because frozen enemies with an underlying Hydro Aura, which is the default state of enemies after you do a setup with Furina and Mika, will give you both a Hydro and a Cryo buff on Wanderer's skill. On top of that, usually the Hydro buff on Wanderer doesn't matter that much because by the time you get to the additional duration, your Bennett buff expired. But Furina's buff lasts longer than Bennett's buff, so you're not actually losing all you care about. And then on top of that, Wanderer is not a melee character and doesn't have hit lags on his attacks, which means that he benefits a lot more from increases in attack speed than melee characters do. All of this to say, should actually be pretty good. Anyways, Quicken teams can slot in Furina as the last slot, but that just ends up making them Quickbloom teams. But any pre-existing Quicken team can effectively be transformed into a Quickbloom team if you can fit a healer in it by putting Furina in. Ayato teams, kind of similar to Mono Hydro, gonna be pretty good. Lyney teams are kind of interesting. I don't think Lyney teams will be all that great because obviously you would not be vaping Lyney, you'd be vaping Furina's damage. But the problem with that is, well, every time you vape Furina's damage, it wipes the Pyro Aura. And if you hit an enemy that doesn't have a Pyro Aura with Lyney, which is going to be every time that Furina has hit the enemy, you don't benefit from the additional damage. So Lyney actually doesn't have very good synergy with Furina. Other characters you can use Furina with are like Xiao, but with Xiao it's a little bit harder to do a team that makes sense because he doesn't benefit from the attack speed that Mika gives, and he already gets a lot of damage percent from his burst, which makes Furina's buff a little bit less useful overall. And he also has an artifact set that gives him a lot more value to begin with in Vermilion than Maréchaussée does. Than Desert Pavillon does. Vermilion just gives a lot more stats overall, so the gap between the two is a lot smaller. And hell, if anything, if you're not using Bennett, Vermilion's probably gonna be better than Maréchaussée in most situations. So all in all, he doesn't gain nearly as much benefit because he doesn't gain a benefit from being able to run Maréchaussée. Hell, he can run Maréchaussée without Furina. He already drains his own HP, and he already gets a lot of damage percent. You can use it on a character like Raiden in Hyper teams, but Raiden and Hyper teams kind of already have set things that work well with it. I can definitely see something like this might be alright, but you again, right, you lose a lot of damage percent you gain a lot of damage percent already on Raiden, so you're probably going to benefit a little bit less from Furina's buff, but this should still be a pretty good team. You could also do it with Xiao. She will also be a pretty good option for Eula. You can use her with Eula, something like Mika, and then Electro Unit like Fischl or Raiden. Klee, I haven't mentioned much, but can be used in a double Hydro reverse vape with her plus Xingqiu, or you can kind of just do quote-unquote mono pyro Klee with like Bennett, Kazuha, Klee, and then use her instead of Xiangling and end up forward vaping her or a decent part of her damage. I don't know if I see it being better than Xiangling. Right, this is a team where you could potentially swap a lot more, so you wouldn't necessarily need to use someone like Jean or Xiao as your healer, and Bennett might be enough. Next, let's get into some slightly more dank archetypes. So, HyperFridge is also gaining a new cryo healer next patch with Charlotte. And while I'm fairly disappointed with Charlotte overall, as a driver for a Hyperbloom team, she will be pretty alright. I can definitely see her being played in some Burgeon teams where you end up doing double Hydro with her, whatever Pyro trigger, and then a Dendro healer. I mean, there's obviously going to be the Subarquetypes for both, so Curry, I think is going to be fine, but not necessarily all that great, because this is a team that does care a little bit more about the speed of your Hydro app, so I'm not sure I can see it benefiting from her all that much, because like you will need a healer. It's basically gonna need to be Baiju or Xiao, so that's one character that doesn't benefit from her buff. We need a Pyro trigger that's being built for full EM, so not really gonna benefit from her buff. And then you need an Electro unit that can benefit from the buff. All in all, should be fine, but nothing too great. You can do Sauté. And this is actually going to be fairly interesting, because there definitely might be some setups where you can forward vape a decent amount of Furina's damage, while also still getting a decent amount of Burgeons. You would get less Burgeons than with a character like Yelan. However, unlike Yelan, you get a lot larger portion of your damage that's reactable, right? So what I mean by that is half of the horses, half of the ushers, and all of the crabs can react, whereas with Yelan, a third of the burst hits can react, and then the E's can react. So a larger portion of her damage can react, so you benefit more from vaping, from keeping a burning aura, which is something that you're gonna see a lot in Bain-Marie. Now this is a new team archetype that I've slightly mentioned in the Grizzly pre-release. It's the same idea as Oven, kinda. which is a Burgeon team with a cryo unit. But the ways that the auras interact is different with when you have much slower Hydro. So what's going to end up happening is you're going to have Dendro and Pyro to maintain a burning aura on the enemies. Now, with slow Hydro, you'll be able to vape your Hydro hits, but you're also not going to remove the burning aura for very long, which means that your cryo unit will still be able to trigger a melt on most of their, reactable hits. On top of that, by weakening the burning aura with a reverse melt from the cryo unit, you make it so that the Hydro, the one unit of Hydro, is enough to both vaporize and create a bloom, which your Pyro unit will in turn be able to Burgeon, right? So if we just show the interactions very quickly in action, if you just trigger burning and then Ylan E, you get a vape, but you don't get a bloom. No seed on the ground, nothing to Burgeon. If you do the same thing, but you add a melt in the middle, you get a vaporize and a bloom, which you can then Burgeon. So the idea here is with slow enough Hydro, you'll still be able to melt most of your meltable hits, vape most of your vapable hits, and trigger a decent amount of Burgeon. You're obviously going to need a healer in here, which is going to end up being Baiju or Yao Yao. And then you'd end up using a cryo unit with pretty fast hits, like Risley. This is not something that works with current units. This is something that is only going to work with Furina, but you guys can look forward to that. You can't really play her in the traditional oven because in the traditional oven, you have fast enough Hydro that you have freeze up time on the enemies. That's not happening with her. I think all that's left is the Neuvillette teams now. So for Neuvillette, she's gonna be pretty good. There's honestly not too much to add to that. She is going to be quite good with Neuvillette, and Neuvillette is actually one of, if not the only character where you can really get away without a healer in the team. Because if you're using Prototype Amber on him, and you get that healing back to full with your charge attack, then from being overhealed, you can proc Furina's Ascension 1, get a little bit more healing from that, on top of the Prototype Amber stuff. Now, this isn't actually going to be enough to break even without a healer, but it will be enough to break even with a poor healer like Kuki. That being said, you don't even need to do that because, while you can use a Hyperbloom team with this, you can also just do a normal Neuvillette team that isn't Hyperbloom. You can do Jean Fischl, Jean Zhongli, Kazuha Kuki if you want, right? Kazuha Dori, I guess, although that one's a little bit more sus. Hell, you can even use characters like Diona, characters like Charlotte, like Mika. You've got options. And those are likely going to be Neuvillette's best teams, just because they're going to be pretty brain dead to play and they're going to perform well. You're going to get max stacks very quickly into your rotations, and yeah, you're losing out on one stack on Neuvillette, but that's alright. In any case, as you can see, right, you have a lot of team options. A lot more than for most characters. And that's because at the end of the day, she's a very good unit. Now, I do want to put enough clarifications here. I usually hold back on calling units very good because most of the time it's very easy to justify skipping a unit because whenever it's a carry, well, you're only going to end up actually playing them when you want to play that specific carry. So if you don't actually really like them, they're pretty likely to just end up on the bench. With supports, they're a lot less likely to end up on the bench, like properly bench and not used at all, because they're going to work with a lot of different teams. Now, I don't think she's as good as the actual best supports, because especially lately, I've noticed that they kind of stopped making enemies tankier and have just been starting to make enemies do more damage and kill you more easily instead. And it really seems like they're trying to incentivize defensive utility as something that's even more valuable. And because Furina doesn't offer any of it, and if anything, removes some defensive utility by making you lose HP, I don't think she offers enough outside of that to be a competitive unit in terms of overall how good I consider her to be, with the really strong characters that also offer defensive utility like Xingqiu and Bennett. But she definitely, assuming you have some form of defensive utility in the rest of your team, or you're good enough at the game not to need defensive utility, she definitely provides a lot for the team. And again, right, I want to make it very clear, I'm a little bit more lenient in terms of the words I use to qualify supports than I am with carries. So when I say she's very good, I don't actually mean that she's significantly stronger than carries that I call decent. But I do think she's a fairly good unit. I've seen a whole spectrum of takes about her. I've seen people thinking that she's useless because Yelan and Xingqiu exist. I've seen people thinking she power creates Yelan and Xingqiu and is going to shift Xingqiu out of the meta altogether. I think both of those ideas are pretty far from reality. I think it's somewhere in the middle, for sure. I definitely think that there are some carries for whom Furina will increase their ceiling and give them stronger teams. I don't think she does that for everyone. She does also have the upside compared to Xingqiu and Yelan that she doesn't need to work with normal in charge attacks. So she works with characters that don't do them. Which as of right now, I'd say isn't that big of a deal, but definitely could be an indicator that they're gonna start designing more characters similar to Neuvillette and Lyney, and I guess Ganyu to some extent, that don't really want to weave normal attacks in their rotations. I could definitely see that being a thing. That would go a bit more towards the her being pretty good side of the equation. Her design is very interesting, and her balance is fairly good. She's definitely on the stronger side, rather than on the weaker side. I like that she incentivizes healers. I think that's really cool. Healing in general is not that useful in the game, and having units that give you a reason to heal, and not just that, but that differentiates between healers, where having more healing and having AoE healing is more valuable than just having enough healing to get by. It gives an additional layer of balance to healers that can be very interesting. However, I can also see the other side, which is that the fact that they're doing that means that they're probably not going much further than they have in terms of making enemies more aggressive, and there's a limit to how much they're willing to make you necessitate a healer through the content, which I'm slightly disappointed by. I think when there is challenging content, it's more rewarding to overcome it, but I also understand that that's not the case for everyone. Obviously, in a perfect world, we'd have that challenging content in a new form of endgame content that isn't just Abyss, but anyways, we're not gonna get into that today. Okay, Constellations. Constellation 1, love is a rebellious bird that none can tame. When using Let the People Rejoice, Furina will gain 150 fanfare. Additionally, Furina's fanfare limit is increased by 100. In other words, more damage percent. It's pretty good. Constellation 2. While Let the People Rejoice lasts, Furina's fanfare gain from increases or decreases in nearby characters' HP is increased by 250%. Each point of fanfare above the limit will increase Furina's max HP by 0.35%. Her maximum HP increase is 140%. Realistically, this isn't really going to give you more damage percent because already with this plus a healer, you're starting pretty close to full stacks, but it will fairly significantly increase her personal damage by increasing her HP by a large amount. It's also a pretty good constellation. Constellation 3 increases the level of Let the People Rejoice by 3. Now, her elemental burst actually has an interesting way that it scales with levels. So if you look at the damage percent you gain per stack, it starts at 0.07, and at talent level 10, it's 0.25, which is like 3.5 times more. Whereas when you look at the usual scaling for things, from talent level 1, 3.23, to talent level 10, 5.82, it's not even 2 times, right? Which means the amount of damage you're gaining from talent levels per talent level is actually a little bit more on this than it is on the average thing. At C0, your average amount of stacks is going to be at around 250, and each stack is about 0. Let's look at Crown, sure, for a total of 63-ish on average. At Constellation 1, you gain 150 instantly and the limit is increased by 100. So realistically, that brings your average up to around 375, because instead of starting at 200 and ramping to 300, you start at 350 and you ramp it up to 400. Maybe it's even more than that, like 380-ish, which brings your average amount of damage percent to around 95. Constellation 2 will increase personal damage and will slightly increase because you're basically going to max it out instantly, so you'll have full uptime on this. And then Constellation 3, I'm going to bring this to 0.31%, which is a nice additional 24%. In other words, From the Constellation 3, you gain about as much as the Constellation 1, a little bit less. It's a pretty decent constellation as well. Constellation 4, when the Salon members from Salon Solitaire hit an opponent, or the Singers of Many Waters restore HP to the active character, Furina will restore 4 energy. This effect triggers once every 5 seconds, so over a 20-second rotation, that's 4 times. 16 energy restore. That basically solves her ER requirement in most teams. You're still gonna need a little bit in teams where she's solo Hydro, but it's a pretty good constellation as well. This doesn't do that much if you don't go for her signature, but if you do go for her signature, it's a pretty nice one to get. Basically lets you swap from ER to HP stands in team where you need energy. Constellation 5 increases the E talent levels, which is going to increase her personal damage. It's also a pretty decent constellation. And finally, Constellation 6 is a book. It's a fucking essay. When you use her skill, she gains a Hydro Infusion for up to 10 seconds, but it won't actually last 10 seconds, similar to like Yelan's C6. During that time, her normal attacks deal additional damage equal to 15% of her HP, and she can only get it up to 7 times. So it's 7 hits of increased damage. Now, depending on your alignment, it'll have a different effect. If you're on the Uzia, the damage alignment, it heals the party a little bit. And if you're on the Pneuma alignment, the healing effect, it significantly increases the damage that it deals. So realistically, I would expect you to want to do something like use your E, swap to the healing Pneuma alignment, do the big hits, and then swap back. Or if you need the healing, if you're playing her in a team without a healer, you just don't swap back. Because especially with her C2, her max HP is going to be very high, right? Like, you're running her on an HP Sands. At C2 plus, there's a good argument to go Hydro Goblet as well. But you're running her on an HP Sands plus up to 140 from this, which is a lot. Like, her actual HP is going to be 50k plus. So 4% of her max HP, plus the fact that, well, you have talent level 13 on the burst. That's 13% healing per fanfare, and you have 400 stacks. So your healing is increased by 50% because of that. So it's actually the equivalent of about 6% of her max HP. So it's like 3k plus per second. It'll last for about 5 seconds, so that's about 15k plus, which is basically more or less enough to break even. Not gonna quite break even on her, but that's not the end of the world. It stacks? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, well, that's even more healing then, yeah. So yeah, you heal a lot. So you can either keep her on the damage version of her E, and this makes you not need a healer anymore if you're willing to normal attack on her a few times, or swap to the healing version of her E so that when you do these attacks, you don't heal, right? If you still have a healer, but it does a lot more damage. Overall, basically each of her constellations is a pretty nice one. None of them are like omega insanely game-breaking by themselves, but each of them is fairly significant. So there's no like real specific breakpoint for like for example, for Raiden, there's like no reason to ever go higher than C3 because the C4, 5, and 6 are so minor. All of her constellations are fairly good. Let's get into the usual pre-release stuff. Now, in order to look at the weapons, we need to talk about her ER requirements. Let's do a quick little refresher on how energy works in Genshin. Let's use Ningon because she has a 40 cost burst and it'll be easier to see visually the difference. Alright, if I start with no energy, I hold my E, I catch the particles on Ning, and as you guys can see, my energy goes a little bit above half. If I don't swap to Ning to catch the particles, and instead catch them on another character, we're a little bit closer to 40%-ish. If I get the same amount of particles but of a different element, I only get closer to like 20%. If I do the same thing with Bennett, but I don't catch the particles on Ning, even lower than that. We might as well also show clear particles, because there's no reason not to, really. Alright, so we also get 3 particles from a Fav proc, so let's get a Fav proc. Alright, we're around 40-ish as well. Pretty similar to if it was a geoparticle that we didn't catch. And finally, if we don't catch these 5 particles, we're at around 20-ish%. So, I wanted to have like this actual visual demonstration of it because I think it makes it easier to understand. But when you generate a particle, depending on whether the character catches them or not, and depending on whether it's the same element or not, you'll get a different amount of energy. So if it's the same element, different element, and a clear particle from something like Fav, if you catch them, if it's caught versus if it's not caught, are all going to be different values of energy you're gaining. Same element caught is 3 energy per particles, and obviously that's increased by energy recharge. Same element but not caught, 1.8. Different element caught, 1, not caught, 0.6, and clear caught, 2, and not caught, 1.2. And this is the energy you gain per particle. What that means is, depending on which team you end up playing, you'll generate a different amount of energy, which is why ER requirements are so difficult to answer as, you know, a general answer, because some characters generate more energy than others. Some characters generate, well, characters of the same element generating more energy matters more than characters of different elements generating more energy. Are you using Favonius on your team? There's a lot of factors that go into ER requirements. And that's why it's so difficult to have a one-size-fits-all answer for ER requirements. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few examples and look at more or less where Furina's ER requirements will end up being. Her particle generation is going to depend on precise timings on her summon hits. Should be around 6 to 7 particles. We can assume about 7 because, again, most people don't actually have perfectly tight rotations that end after 20 seconds. And if you do a 21 or 22 second rotation, Furina's kill keeps going because it lasts for 30 seconds. However, unlike a character like Xingqiu or Elan, the particles are going to be generated over the whole duration of your rotation rather than all in one go. What that means is she's not going to be catching most of them unless you're unfielding her, which you don't really want to do because there's no good upside for it. So most of her particles are going to be not caught, which means they're going to generate less energy. That being said, she generates more particles, but kind of offset that. Anyways, let's start by looking at... You could take a look at that Wanderer team without C6 Farazan. You should generally do EQ, which means that during your burst animation, you'll be able to catch a particle from your summons. So you'll catch one of your particles, not catch the other about 6. And because she's the only Hydro character, that's it for the same element particles. Now, different element particles. Wanderer is a little bit weird, but if you do the normal attack before... Actually, in this team, you get the Hydro thing, so you might be able to get 6 animal particles from him, right? Farazan, you get 2, and if you're not at C6, you'll only get it once per rotation. So it's 2 that she's also not catching because Farazan at non-C6 is going to need to catch her own particles. And then Mika, elemental skill, particles 4. But you are also not catching them on Furina. Now, on top of that, you're getting some energy particles from killing enemies. Enemies will drop elemental particles or clear particles when they are reduced below certain HP thresholds. The exact amount is obviously going to depend on which enemy you're fighting. I like to assume somewhat on the lower end because if you only have enough ER when enemies drop a lot of particles, then when enemies don't drop a lot of particles, it's going to feel like shit to play. So I generally assume about 2 clear particles per rotation from enemy drops. And then you're going to get 1 Fav proc on Mika, 1 Fav proc on Farazan. So 2 Fav procs for 6 clear particles, which gives you a total before energy recharge of about 32 energy per burst. Cost is 60, which means that your ER requirements are going to be around 186%. Yeah, because it's a double Fav team, it's not actually as bad as it otherwise could be. Oh yeah, wait, actually, these are not caught, you're right. The clear particles that you get are going to be caught on a Wanderer, not on her. So it's closer to 196, but yeah. Let's take a look at a few other examples. If you're playing her with something like Hytham, Baiju, Electro, Furina, that Electro is generally going to be Raiden or Kuki. Let's assume Kuki. Now, in a team like this, you don't really want Fav on Kuki. You don't really want Fav on Hytham. You can use Fav on Baiju. A lot of people are going to use Prototype Amber. Let's take a look at what happens with Proto Amber. Proto Amber on Baiju, Furina's ER requirements, 235.29. Fav on Baiju, 206. A lot more manageable, but still fairly high. The point I'm getting at with all this, her ER requirements in some teams is going to be very high. However, her ER requirements in other teams are going to be very low. So let's take a look at Neuvillette, Jean, Zhongli, Furina. So you're probably not wanting to funnel Neuvillette particles into her. But Neuvillette in a 24-second rotation generates about 8 particles. On top of that, in a 24-second rotation, her skill generates more particles because it's a bit longer. Let's do 7 off-field particles instead of 6. Jean is going to get 2 E's in a rotation like this probably, which is 2.67 average, so 2.67 times 2. Zhongli, it's always a little sus to assume Zhongli particles. Generally, I like assuming no more than 3 per rotation. So not a lot of different element particles, but you can very much have Jean on 5 and Zhongli on 5. You can also only have Zhongli on 5. So if Zhongli's the only one on 5, your ER requirements are around 150. If Zhongli and Jean are both on 5, if it's low refined 5, 136. If it's high refined 5, where you can proc the 5 on each Jean E in your rotation because you want to do 2 E's, 126. So ER requirements can be as high as like in the 230s if you have very low particle generation in your team, but they can also be as low as the 120s if you have very high particle generation. And if we go to the like true extreme, we're gonna funnel one of Neuvillette's E's into Furina because Neuvillette should get enough energy from the particles that Furina's generating while he's on field that he's not going to need it. We take away 4 particles from the non-caught and we add them to caught. That makes ER requirements even lower. You can also take a look at, I don't know, a quad hydro team. Kokomi, Xingqiu, Yelan, Furina, where you're going to have no particles of a different element. And even if you don't battery anything into her, you're going to get maybe 1 proc from Kokomi plus her own proc, and then about 6, and then about 4 to 5 particles from Kokomi, and then 2 Yelan E's and a Xingqiu E. And in a team like this, with no 5s, you're at around 120 ER requirements. And if you get 1 5, well, 2 5s, well, it's no ER. Yeah, hopefully the point is being driven home. Her ER requirements are gonna depend a lot on where you want to use her, and that's gonna make it so that weapons that offer some form of ER will perform very differently based on which team she's being used in. Okay, so let's talk about the weapons in teams where your ER requirements are honestly anywhere above like 160-ish. Festering Desire is going to be an insanely good option. And Fleuve Cendre, for those of you who were not playing back in 1.3, is going to be a fairly decent alternative to it. In teams where her ER requirements are lower, it starts losing a little bit of value because, well, it's a weapon that gives ER. So, overall, her signature is best in slot, generally. However, and I really want to like insist on this, if you play her in the sort of teams where she needs high ER, her signature is only ever so slightly ahead of Festering. It's like around 10% when you actually have ER requirements, which makes it a pretty bad signature overall. Next up, I'm gonna tell you right now, Lo-Fi, Haran, Mist Splitter, all those 5-star like stat sticks, not really worth it. Because even at low ER, they're only slightly ahead of Festering, and realistically, you're never gonna need no ER. You're always gonna need at least a little bit. They're gonna be a little bit better of an alternative at low ER if you don't have Festering and if you're using Fleuve Cendre instead, but honestly, not by much. If you need literally no ER and you have the 5-star weapons, they're gonna be slightly better, but otherwise they're not. So I'll be discounting them. Freedom Sworn hurts her personal damage a bit too much in my opinion to really be worth it, which leaves us with the other 2 5-star weapons being Jade Cutter and Key. I would actually put Key generally above Jade Cutter. Jade Cutter personal damage is higher than Key because obviously it gives a not completely useless stat, it gives HP. But honestly, Jade Cutter is only ever so slightly ahead of the other 5-star stat sticks. And again, worse than Festering and Fleuve Cendre at high ER requirements. The thing about Key is I'm not actually sure if you'll be able to properly get your Key from doing EQ or if you're gonna have to wait. Her E does damage on the initial hit and then the summons deal damage, but they don't attack exactly at the same time. So I'm not sure if there is going to be that 0.3 second delay between the first of the 3 summon hits and the third. That would be necessary for you to get 2 stacks from that plus the one you get from the initial cast, which would get you you 3 stacks in the effect. If so, then this weapon is actually very good in basically any team that has reactions, because it's not too far behind Festering in terms of personal damage, and it will be a pretty big buff to the team damage. So it's pretty nice. But yeah, like for context, Jade Cutter is about as good as Festering if Festering's ER requirements are useful. It's a bit better than Fleuve Sound. I'm going to talk about Fav at the end. Dog Hand, not really that good because it's not better than the ER weapons if you need the ER. And if you don't need the ER, it's not really better than the other stat sticks. Overall, it's kind of whatever. Fleuve Sound is her best in slot, like general 4-star for those who were not playing back when Festering came out. Festering obviously is better. Harbinger is a very, very niche weapon that will only be good when you don't need the ER and you're playing a healer that consistently full heals your whole team and keeps it full healed for the whole rotation, like maybe something like Kokomi. But even then, even with Kokomi, you still have, you know, about half of your rotation where you're not healing. You still won't have full uptime on it. Maybe Noelle, but even then, right? It's more of a meme. I don't actually think I'm going to include it. And then you have Wolffang and Sapwood Blade. Sapwood Blade is going to be a fine option when your ER requirements aren't too high in teams that have a Dendro reaction, where like you don't get that much out of going Fleuve Sound. You don't have a better weapon for personal damage. The Sapwood Blade Leaf can be useful, but it's generally more of a niche option. Wolffang is a bit better than something like Festering if you have low ER requirements. Obviously worse at high ER requirements. It's a decent amount better than Fleuve Sound if you don't have Festering. But yeah, even at R5, if you do need the ER, it doesn't beat the ER weapons. And then finally you have Favonius, which at much higher ER requirements is going to be her best option, because at much higher ER requirements, you get full advantage out of both the energy generation from Festering and the ER the ER substat. And it also helps with the rest of your team, a little bit in the same vein as Sapwood and Klee by generating energy for them. But yeah, overall, Fav is going to be a pretty decent option whenever you need energy. If I were to order them, I'd have Splendor first, then probably Klee. I think Klee is close enough to Festering at high ER that the team buff will make it better, so good if EM is useful for the team. Then I would have Festering Desire, best in slot 4-star. Then Jade Cutter, good at low ER. Then probably Fav and Fleuve Sound. Fav, very good at very high ER. Fleuve Sound, default 4-star. And then Wolffang, decent at low ER. And then Sapwood Blade, fine. Artifact sets. That's big numbers. We like those numbers. Marie-Josée doesn't work when your character is not on field, so you don't actually want this on her, unfortunately. And this is just real good. It gives you a lot of damage. 70 damage percent is huge. As far as I understand, Furina's Drain doesn't work to proc, like it doesn't count as taking damage, so it won't work on this. Dea is an exception where she actually deals damage to herself, which is why it works on her. Furina doesn't do that. She just drains HP. Maybe they change that. If that's the case, then it might be alright, but as of now, no. I guess if you play her in a Nilou team, this is a fine option, but honestly, I'd probably still run Golden Troop. You can use TOM as like a fine option, but generally the 70% damage percent for her will give you more damage than 20% attack for the team, because she doesn't benefit from the attack. And yeah, there's also 20% HP from her, but it's a fine option if you already have a really good one, but I would definitely try to get a Golden Troop instead. So it's really just 4-piece Golden Troop, best in slot, and then 4-piece TOM, fine, 2-piece, 2-piece, fine, but you really, really want to work your way towards a good Golden Troop set. Next up, artifact stats. And this is actually fairly interesting because since she gets so much damage percent from Golden Troop and from her own burst giving her damage percent, you actually kind of want to run an HP Goblet over a Hydro Goblet, which makes the default artifact stats to go for HP, HP, crit. However, ER, HP, crit, if you need the ER. Right, so if you're running a non-ER weapon, like her signature or key, in a team where you need ER, like the relatively high ER, then you're going to want ER HP crit. You can consider HP Hydro crit if you're running a weapon that gives you a lot of HP, like key, or if you don't have a good HP goblet because it's not that far behind. That being said, when it comes to key, do keep in mind, you will do slightly more personal damage with something like this, but you'll have less HP, which means your EM buff for the rest of your team will be lower. Now, is that worth it? Depends on the team. I'd say generally they're kind of interchangeable. Another very interesting consequence of her kit is that it has the potential of changing the optimal artifact set and artifact stats of the rest of the team. 4-piece Maréchaussée is going to be your best option for your on-fielder in most teams where you end up using her. And a lot of carries will now be able to go attack crit, or the ones that need ER attack crit, or ER EM crit, or EM crit, or whatever the fuck, right? The point being, it reduces the value of damage goblets for the rest of the team because she gives so much damage percent. For the same reason why Bennett reduces the value of attack substats, because he gives so much attack, Furina reduces the value of damage goblets. Now, does that mean that you're always going to want a damage goblet? No. Or that you're always going to want an HP for HP scalers or attack for attack scaler goblet? No, definitely not. But it's one more damage buff that can make attack goblets and HP goblets closer, and in some situations even better. So, if you find a really good Maréchaussée, HP or attack, or even defense, because I mean, I don't know what's coming next. There might be a defense scaler eventually that wants to work with her. If you're getting one of those with good substats, keep it. It might actually be pretty good. Well, yeah, I guess another consequence for artifact sets is some healers are going to want to be shifted away from what's traditionally their best in slot set in order to maximize healing. And you might actually want to use 4-piece maidens on some of your healers instead of what you'd usually do with being like Noblesse or Instructor, because you will need more healing on some healers if you want to break even with Furina's Drain. Same thing for Clan, yeah. Next, for teams, I'm not going to go too deep into teams because I've already talked about them quite a bit. I'll basically just say this. Basically, every team that has an actual healer, she's going to be good in. Yeah, one thing I want to add is when you're playing her in double Hydro teams, I think even more so than usual, Yelan's potential for higher damage will shine when compared to Xiao, and her lack of defensive utility will be more felt as well. Because when you're playing double Hydro teams, well, again, right, Furina drains your HP, which means that when you don't have defensive utility whatsoever, it makes you even more vulnerable than usual. But Furina helps Yelan's ER requirements and buffs her damage a nice amount to the point where, like, the personal damage is going to be pretty good. I don't think either of them is going to be, like, always better. I still would generally tend to use Xiao over Yelan, but some people are more willing to play without defensive options than I am, so that won't be the case for everyone. But what do I mean by actual healer? Well, let's talk about healers. Before we talk about any of these, let's talk about other characters that have some healing but that aren't actual healers. Goro heals about enough to offset Furina's Drain on one of your 4 characters, which means that he definitely does not heal enough to offset Furina's Drain on all 4 characters. Even on a full healing build, he's not even close to healing enough. Xiao, pretty similar. Prototype Amber is like a pretty cope thing. You can use it with one of the weaker healers to help strengthen how much healing, or to help strengthen their healing, and it can be fine when you have a weak healer plus Proto Amber, but by itself it's not the greatest. It's alright. But what healers are weak, what healers are strong. So, Barbara is a strong asterisk healer. Her burst generally will full heal your team, if you can use it. She doesn't generate any particles. Furina does generate hydro particles, which are going to help Barbara's burst a little bit, but it's still an 80 cost. Now, some of her constellations help her with energy, but if you're not spending time on her, you're not getting this, and this is 2 energy per rotation. I have no idea why this even exists, which means you can kinda use her, but you're gonna need to have her on 5 with a full ER build and it might even not be enough if the rest of your team doesn't generate that much. So yeah, strong asterisk healer, because her E does not heal very much at all. Bennett is a strong but even more asterisk. Bennett is one of the highest single target healing in the game, but it's single target, it can't overheal, and it's circle impact, which is a lot of asterisks. Technically it can overheal. Okay, I guess that's kind of true. It technically can overheal if your on-fielder doesn't have that much HP and they're at like 69.9% HP, and Bennett's healing ticks are more than 30% of your character's HP. They can full heal and then overheal. It won't happen too often. Bennett can work with Furina, but only in teams where you can freely swap, because you'll need to swap into your whole team to heal them back up with Bennett multiple times a rotation. Noelle is a strong healer. No asterisk. Actually, no, there's still an asterisk. She's a strong healer, but she needs field time to heal. Jean, no asterisks! Woohoo! She's a strong healer. You press Q on Jean, it full heals the whole team. She's a very strong healer with Furina. And this isn't how good they are overall, this is how good they are at healing for Furina teams. Chi-Chi. She's pretty strong. But she also has an asterisk, because most of her healing is only to the on-fielder. Diona is a weak healer. She doesn't heal a very large amount, and it's only to the active character. Sayu, strong with asterisks. If you have C6, she'll heal a pretty large amount. You're not quite gonna full heal your team from the AoE heal, but relatively close to it. And then one proc of healing on each character is fairly doable, and with that, you should full heal them. That plus the AoE heal from the initial cast of the burst. Kokomi, strong. Even though her healing works fairly similarly to Noelle's, there's more of an upside to on-fielding Kokomi because she's just a better unit overall. And she does also have some healing without being on-field. And she can use Proto Amber to make that even nicer. Cookie, weak. But Cookie has an asterisk to her being weak, a weak healer, which is you might still want to use her even if she's a weak healer because she's a good unit. And Cookie's healing plus a prototype Amber can be enough to offset the HP drain. But you are going to have to heal on Cookie as well. Like, spend time on her to heal. Otherwise, you're going to lose damage on Furina, which is not ideal. Dory, just weak overall. By the way, asterisks on strong are things that would prevent them from being called strong. Asterisks on weak are things that would prevent them from being called weak. Which means the more asterisks you have, the closer to in the middle you are. Which means weak with no asterisks is as bad as it gets. Dory's just not all that good with Furina because she only has on-field healing and it doesn't even last for that long. Well, she has kind of enough healing that if you distribute it perfectly, you can full heal the team. You have to distribute it perfectly because she doesn't actually have like any to spare, unlike a character like Chi-Chi that has a lot to spare, right? If you're actually looking at how much healing you're doing, right, with an off-field Dory, it's like about 50k. Now, Furina with HP crit is at around 40k HP herself. So 20k of this 48k has to go to restore the half HP cost for Furina, which means you have to spend time on Furina, which is not good. And you only have 30k for the rest of your team, which should be more or less enough if you have no other HP scalers, but even then, like, you actually have to swap into the right units. It's suboptimal. Although, I will also actually put an asterisk, because at C6, if you are on-fielding her, she does actually have very good healing. Yao Yao, strong. Xiao is the healer that heals the most in the game by a pretty large margin. It's kind of crazy how much she heals. 50k to the whole team at C6, 40 some k to the whole team at C0. Mika, also unironically strong, right? If we're looking at healers that can just press one button and then swap out, Charlotte at C1 plus is generally going to be your highest healing. And then you have Baiju if you can fit 2 skills, which generally doesn't really happen. Most Baiju rotations end up only using 1 skill a rotation. And then you have Jean, and Mika is just barely behind. On top of that, Mika heals more overall because his healing over time after like pressing the button is stronger, which means that your on-field unit is going to be less vulnerable because they're not going to get drained back to 50% HP as quickly. Yeah, he doesn't do too much outside of that healing, But in terms of healing, Mika is very strong. And he does it with basically no field time. And the attack speed is useful on some characters. Baizhu is also strong. Baiju's biggest potential issue is that it can be pretty difficult to reach his ER requirements in some teams with only one skill of rotation. Like, Fav plus ER Send still not enough difficult. And if you don't do 2 E's per rotation and you don't burst, you don't heal enough to offset Furina. Like, you'll basically heal Furina back to 75%, like he himself back to 75%, and the rest of your team back to 100%, because obviously HP scalers have more max HP, therefore lose more HP from Furina's HP drain because it's a percentage of their HP. So you need to heal them back up more, and because he's an HP scaler and Furina's an HP scaler, they're both going to have higher HP totals. One skill is going to heal you about 10k on a typical Baizhu build, which means if that's all you're doing, you're going to have about 150 stacks front loaded and about 50% uptime on 4 stacks for Furina's skill, like 10% per character she's draining, and about 50% at 2 stacks, where both Baizhu and Furina will be back to 50%, but your non-HP scalers will not, right? They'll still be high enough that they can still be drained. And in that case, he's fine. He also doesn't do anything other than that if you don't use his burst, which makes him not very good. But when you do manage to reach his ER requirements, he's very good, because he's healing a lot. Whether you're doing it by using 2 E's, which means that, well, healing your whole party more, because his E healed, his burst heals, although only the active character. And if you're using him on Prototype Amber, that can heal as well. He's got a lot of healing, and his Dendro App is useful. And then finally, you have Charlotte, who is strong with an asterisk, because they just nerfed Charlotte. I had recorded a pre-release for her, and I ended up scrapping it because they nerfed her and it made me just completely unexcited for her. Effectively, they nerfed her particle generation a lot, which means that she's going to be stuck to either Prototype Amber or Fav. Honestly, you might struggle with ER requirements on Proto Amber. You might actually need to go Fav in a lot of teams. What Charlotte does is she basically has a cope version of Nahida's E, but Cryo, and then a cope version of Jean's Burst, but Cryo. That's basically her kit. She's a catalyst user, so she can be used to drive. The problem is her E only lasts 6 seconds and only generates 3 energy and has a long cooldown. You can hold the E to get an empowered version that lasts for 12 seconds and restores 5 particles, or generates 5 particles, but you have to like wait for the camera to focus for it to do that, and that takes like 2 seconds by itself. She's still fine because, well, she heals a lot, so, and that's what Furina wants. And if you have her C1 or higher, she is the highest press 1 button healing, right? Because characters that heal more than that are characters that need to spend time on the field, right? Like Xiao. She has that going for her, but yeah, I'm very disappointed. Anyways, overall, I'm excited for Furina. I think she's not going to really make any character a significant amount stronger, because maybe except Risley. Not even then, honestly. Like, she's not gonna make any, like, specific carry a significant amount stronger, because the character she has the best synergy with is arguably Neuvillette, and as much as she has good synergy with Neuvillette, with her you don't get his 3rd stack. So you are sacrificing something for that good synergy. So while it will be a nice team, it's not going to be his only good team. It's going to be a nice thing if you have C1 Neuvillette, of course, but yeah. What she is going to do, though, is take a lot of units that were phased out of the meta because they didn't really offer enough and bring them back in, right? Characters like Mika that just kind of suck because they don't really do much. Characters like Jean, characters like Noelle are going to have a whole second lifespan thanks to Furina. And as much as I think it's not necessarily the best design, I do like the intent behind their design to reinvigorate some of the healers. I do like that. I think that's really nice. So thank you all for dropping by. I hope you enjoyed your stay, and I'm very much looking forward to being able to test her in a bunch of teams. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.